Here, Grammatica Techne, Grammar Introducing Aspect. In this lesson, we'll discuss an overview. What is aspect? We'll discuss a little bit how different languages handle and prioritize tense, aspect, and mood. We'll talk about what it means for Greek to be aspect primary, and we'll look at the three aspects in Greek. This is a fairly high-level video, and there are two reasons to cover this material. One reason is to give you a sense of where we're going in the language. The second reason is as a preventative measure against some incorrect ideas of aspect that can be found all over the place, especially in textbooks. And so although you don't need to learn aspect explicitly to understand Greek, and in fact I would encourage you not to think about it too much as we go on, it can be very helpful to be forewarned and forearmed against some of the grammatical explanations you might encounter. So, aspect. What is opsis? Opsis, to be honest, is not an ancient grammatical term, but it is an ancient Greek word, opsis, and it seems a reasonable adaptation for what we mean by aspect. Aspect is a way of speaking about the event, state, or action of a rema, of a verb, in terms of its temporal structure. So, that's still a fairly high-level description of what we're talking about. We're talking not about the time of the action, past, present, future, but we're talking about the temporal structure of the action. How is it seen and how is it presented? It'll become clearer as we see the different aspects in play. So let's talk about time, aspect, and mood across languages. Time, or tense, refers to how a language deals with when an action happens. Aspect refers to how a language presents the temporal structure of an action. And mood refers to how a language presents things like the speaker's attitude towards the action. Different languages deal with these things differently. And in particular, different languages place priority on these features differently. Primarily in the way that some of these features are necessary to express, some of these features are optional to express. In English, for example, tense is generally speaking obligatory. You must refer to the time of the action. You can't get away from that. We have two main morphological tenses, past and non-past, and then we have a range of modal and auxiliary verbs which play an important role in the way English portrays actions. Latin is a fairly tensed language, and although it shares some aspect features with Greek, tense seems to be more primary than aspect at most places. And so when we think about different forms in Latin, we tend to be thinking about different temporal relationships, not temporal structures. Greek, however, is aspect primary and obligatory. That is, when we think about the verbal system in Greek, aspect is the main thing driving the choices between different forms. This is especially important when we get outside the indicative. So the indicative are all our forms, all our words talking about statements of what is and is not the case. But once you get into other moods, once you get into the subjunctive, into the imperative, into the optative, into participles, time is not the thing that is in view. But aspect always is. You cannot get away from expressing aspect in Greek. The indicative system in Greek is temporally marked, at least from Homer onwards, or after Homer. And it's marked, generally speaking, by the augment, by the epsilon or a lengthening that happens at the start of the verb. That tells you that a verb is marked for the past. But outside the indicative system, there are no temporal markings. So the non-indicative systems, as I said, the optative, the subjunctive, the imperative, and the participle system, and infinitives are aspectual. There's a different aspect for different forms which doesn't have a time or a time-based importance. Sometimes, though, they have temporal implications. That is, something can be marked for aspect but have tense implications. How many aspects are there? 3 in Greek. Often we talk about two primary aspect distinctions, and some of the early work in aspect, particularly in Slavic languages, in Russian, refers to this contrast between perfective and imperfective, which we'll see. But in Greek there is a third aspect, and that's something of a source of confusion for some. So obviously, what are the aspects in Greek? Well, terminology varies. I use a set of terminology in this course, which I think is fairly consistent, which I think reflects ancient usage to a large extent, and which I think reflects contemporary understandings. So I will use in English the terms perfective, imperfective, and stative or resultative completive. A lot of my work and my understanding of aspect is derived from Michael Aubrey, and he talks about resultative completive as the aspect of the perfect system. A lot of people talk about it as stative. That's fairly established, especially among people working with classical Greek. Either of those is fine, I think, as long as we understand exactly what we are talking about. So perfective, imperfective, and resultative completive. We'll see their Greek names in a minute. So firstly, he aoristos opsis, or the perfective. Pay careful attention, perfective, not perfect. Here's a quote from Comrie, who did a lot of initial work on aspect. The perfective is the view of a situation as a single whole, without distinction of the various separate phases that make up that situation. So the perfective presents an external event structure, undifferentiated. It is bounded in its semantics. Think of the whole as a whole package, kind of like a sphere, and what's going on inside the sphere is opaque. So the internal temporal structure of the event, of the action, of the verb, is opaque. We can't see inside that sphere. The speaker presents it from that outside perspective. And the point of this is they're not interested in presenting the internal workings of that action. The perfective aspect is instantiated in the aorist tense forms. That is, the forms that we call aorist forms in Greek are perfective, and probably future tense forms as well. I'll talk about that a little bit later when we talk about the future. Now, second is the imperfective, he paratatike opsis. Again, Comrie, the imperfective pays essential attention to the internal structure of the situation. The imperfective presents an internal event structure with attention to instigation, process, and/or completion. It is unbounded in its semantics. So if you think of the perfective as this sphere, presenting the action or event as a sphere, and it's opaque what's going on inside, the imperfective, in a sense, makes that sphere translucent and brings us into the process of the action. And so it often has attention to the beginning of the action, or the ongoing process of the action. It can have focus on the completion of an action, but still with this emphasis on the internal event structure. Often imperfectives represent an action that has begun or is ongoing without an end in view. And so it's unbounded in its semantics. The imperfective aspect is instantiated in the present and imperfect tense forms. So the present and the imperfect tense forms, they form a pair. And that's why outside the indicative, you don't find present and imperfect participles, for example. You just find present participles because they're imperfective participles. The third aspect is the resultative or completive aspect. And it's not one or the other, it's both. That's why you might also refer to it as stative. In Greek, he parakimene and parakimene opsis. The resultative or completive, or the perfect, not perfective system, stands in opposition to both the other two aspects. So it's a third. We've got a triangle going on here. It is both bounded and telic. So it presents an internal event structure with an intrinsic or extrinsic endpoint. That's a lot of linguistic talk, and this is drawn quite directly from Aubrey. It's bounded, that is, you've got the sphere going on, but it's also telic. There is an endpoint built into the action, and so the focus is on that endpoint. Either an endpoint intrinsic to the action, some actions naturally have an endpoint, or an extrinsic one, that is, some actions can have an endpoint added to them. We'll see a bit more of this when we get to examples. When these verbs are resultative, they present the resultant or achieved state of the action. When they are completive, they present that the event has been done, thoroughly done, done to completion. So that's the difference between resultative and completive. A resultative version of this presents the resultant or achieved state of the action. I have written a book. The book has been written. Both of these emphasize the resultant situation, that the book stands written. When something's completive, this has in view that an event has been done and thoroughly done, especially an action or an event or a state that doesn't normally have an intrinsic endpoint. I ate, I have eaten. There's not typically an endpoint to eating, but I have eaten. I've so eaten that I've thoroughly eaten. I've eaten to the point where I'm totally full. The resultative completive aspect is instantiated in the perfect and pluperfect tense forms. So again here there's a pairing. The perfect tense form represents the non-past, and the pluperfect tense form represents the past in the indicative system. Outside the indicative system, you only find the resultative completive forms. That is, there's not perfect and pluperfect participles, there's just perfect participles. So then we can also talk about he melusa opsis, the future. What's going on in the future? The future tense in Greek appears historically to be the first emergence of a true tense, and that temporal nature remains primary even outside the indicative. That is, even outside the indicative, the futureness of the future doesn't really go away. Is the future perfective or imperfective though? Well, it's unclear and it's debated. Some people treat it as perfective, some people treat it as imperfective. At some points, I'd probably say many points, the way the future tense forms are built off aorist stems suggests a perfective aspect. To me, this makes the most sense of what's going on in the morphology, in the forms of the language. That the aorist forms and the future forms are related, that the way their stems relate and the way their forms relate shows that the future and the aorist stand in the same perfective aspect category. Nonetheless, the future remains and retains a temporal implication even outside the indicative system. So here we have a little bit of an overview, a table. And again, the point at this point is just to get an overview. So up the top in English and then down the bottom in Greek. So we have past, present, future, or you could talk about this as past, non-past, as I will in another video. The aorist and the future form a set, perfective. The imperfect and present form a set, imperfective. The pluperfect and the perfect form a set. Then you have the future perfect. I will not talk about the future perfect very much here, or to be honest in general, because future perfects are incredibly rare in Greek, and they'll be delayed as far as possible in this course. But they do exist, a future perfect. Very often they're periphrastic, they're formed from compounds of a participle and a main verb, but not always. And then the terminology down the bottom in Greek, so the time words up the top, paralelutos chronos, ho enestos chronos, ho melon chronos. And then down the left-hand side, the aspect terms, he aoristos opse, he paratatike opsis, he parikimene opsis. And then the forms in the middle. Aoristos, paratatikos, huperstontelikos, enestos, parakimenos, melon, and parakimenos melon. So on this last slide, we're going to look at some paradigmata, some examples. And in each case, I give an English sentence and then a Greek sentence. I want you to understand that the English examples and the Greek examples are not meant to be, but they are presented as one-to-one glosses and mappings. But you shouldn't walk away from this lesson thinking that the way that the English represents or translates the Greek is the and the only correct way. That's not exactly the mapping we're going for here. I'm just trying to find a simple way to demonstrate the differences and the aspect in play, particularly in the Greek. So here's our first sentence, I walked. I walked in English is a simple past tense. And when we go to the Greek, ebadisa. Ebadisa is a perfective past verb. That is, it's an aorist tense. And it presents ebadisa, I walked. It presents it as a past action. These are all indicative sentences, all statements about what is and is not the case. And so it presents it as a holistic, bounded temporal event. It doesn't tell me anything about the internal structure of that event. It's not portraying the ongoing act of walking, although all acts of walking imply some kind of ongoingness. But I'm simply stating the fact that an event happened, and the internal temporal structure remains somewhat opaque. So, ebadisa. Contrast with I was walking. So in English, this is a compound tense form, isn't it? It's a compound of I was and then the participle walking, and forms a progressive action in the past. And so in English, I was walking has an imperfective idea to it. Ebadizon is imperfect tense form, and so it's an imperfective aspect and past tense form in Greek. That is, the temporal structure here is internal and shows us as a process. And there could be a number of reasons that a speaker chooses to say ebadisa or ebadizon. Ebadizon might indicate that the speaker wants us to know that they started walking. Ebadizon might indicate that the speaker wanted us to know that they were walking when something else happened. Ebadizon might indicate that it was a habitual action. That is, I used to walk as an ongoing, not incessant, but repeated occurrence. Ebadizon can even mean I was walking and completed it. Probably not very likely, but it's within the range of what the imperfective aspect can bring out. So in Greek, in the past, we have this contrast, ebadisa and ebadizon, perfective and imperfective. Now, what happens when we add an end? What happens when we make this telic? I walked to the school. In English, this is still simple past, and it's telling us that there is an endpoint to the walking, that is, I walked to the school, and the whole action is presented as a whole. In Greek, ebadisa prosto didaskaleion. Ebadisa prosto didaskaleion. I walked to the school. Here, the aorist tense form, ebadisa, provides us with something that is perfective, and so the action is still presented as a whole. But an endpoint is presented as part of that whole. I was walking to the school, English past progressive. Greek ebadizon prosto didaskaleion. I was walking to the school brings us into the internal temporal structure of the event of walking to the school, and you almost expect that to be the setting for some other event. Ebadizon prosto didaskaleion, and something else happened. Or I began walking to the school, or I used to walk to the school. All of these are encompassed within the process, the ongoing action of ebadizon. I have walked to the school. In English, the combination of I have and then past participle walked provides a perfect, an English perfect. It's very common to translate Greek perfects as English perfects. And I want to say that it's not wrong, but it's not always right, and it's not always necessary. But at least for our examples today, I'm using an English perfect to represent the Greek perfect. Bebadika prosto didaskalaion. Bebadika. Now, notice two things here. Firstly, bebadika is marked by two features that tell us it's a perfect. Here it has the kappa alpha. The kappa is part of the perfect marking. And then we have reduplication at the front. Beba. Beba. It doesn't have an epsilon augment. And the epsilon augment is what marks past time, past tense. The Greek perfect is not a past tense. It's telling us something about the present. And so here, because it's the action of walking to the school is telic, that is, it has an endpoint, bebadika is focusing us on the fact that, well, I have walked to the school and I have completed that action, and having completed that action, I'm a person who is in the resultant state of having walked to the school. Now, you would never translate it like that. That's too many words. But the focus is on the accomplishment and the resulting, well, I have walked to the school, and so now I am at the school, or I am a person who has achieved and accomplished the task of walking to the school. I had walked to the school is an English pluperfect. E bebadike prosto didaskalaion. E bebadike or e bebadikei. You get a bit of variation in the ending depending on period. And so you can notice here that the epsilon augment has been added to indicate that the pluperfect tense is past. I had walked to the school. So it's a perfect and so a resultative completive aspect, but it's placed and located in the past. I have walked. What happens when we take out the telic nature of to the school and go back to an action without an endpoint? Bebadika. Bebadika. Some verbs have an implied, an intrinsic endpoint. I shut the door. It's my other favorite example for perfects. But some verbs have an intrinsic sense of this is an action that has a goal and can be completed. Some verbs do not. Walking does not have an intrinsic endpoint, and so prosto didaskalaion adds an endpoint. What happens when we remove the endpoint from the sentence? Bebadika, I have walked. The perfect form, and so the resultative completive aspect in Greek, suggests to us that bebadika, I have fully and absolutely walked to the point of being all done walking. It's a bit hard, I would say, with walking to really bring across that sense, but drinking alcohol, I have drunk, and I'm well drunk to the point of total drunkenness. I've eaten so much, and I've completely eaten that I'm totally sated to the point of bursting. Bebadika, I've walked to the utmost. I will walk. What happens when we shift to the future tense form? Well, sadly for us, in terms of morphology, badizdo in the future shifts to a middle form, and the addition of the sigma contracts with the stem, and you get badiumai. So it's less clear morphologically what's going on here. But in terms of aspect, the future tense retains a sense of temporal nature. Certainly, in the indicative, it definitely has a temporal nature, but even outside the indicative, it retains some temporal force. On my view, because it maps to the aorist form morphology, it also shares with the aorist a perfective aspect. And so the future event is presented as bounded, as somewhat holistic and opaque. But really that's contextual, depends upon how the action is portrayed within the context of a text. And so that's our overview of how some of this aspect plays out in one simple example with endpoints, prosto didascaleon, and with alternation between various aspects. I haven't given you a present here at all. Badizdo and badizdo prosto didascaleon, they would be similar to ebadizon because the present is an imperfective in the non-past. That's it for our introducing aspect. I hope that's been enough, but not too much. And really you'll see this in play as we go into Greek texts moving forwards.